Today is Wednesday, September 13, 2018. I'm Cindy Kelly, Atomic Heritage Foundation. And I have with me Alexander Klementiev.
Very good.
And I would like to first start by asking him to say his name and spell it.
My name is Alexander Klementiev, Klementiev.
Great. So people have highly recommended that we interview you about your role in the Downwinders located around Hanford and the issues relating to the exposures they may have received. But incidentally, I learned in talking to you that you also worked on Chernobyl.
True.
Is that correct? Okay. Well, I'm very curious about both. So you have to figure out where should we start? Why don't we start with you just telling us about yourself and where you were born and what your education is and how you happen to get involved in these kinds of environmental exposure issues.
Okay, I was born in Moscow in the wartime, 1942. And remember the after-war time. And sometimes it helps me to understand better life then for those who were not exposed to that. It was kind of special time in my generation time. And then school, then I went to the university. It is called Moskovsky Physico-Technical Institute, Moscow Physico-Technical School. It was kind of a privilege to be there. Just to understand, it was not we paid for education, they paid us for education. And it was good money. So it was the institution specially designed after the war for educating those who would be working in Academy of Sciences on the research and development. Mostly radio, my education is related to that, aviation, rockets, explosion. And radiophysics. That was the direction. Then I got my first Ph.D. in that institution, and pretty soon, I worked after that, I worked in the International Institute for Applied Systems Analysis in Biomedical Project in Vienna, Austria. It sounds nothing special except for the fact that nobody of us were allowed to go abroad. And and I was not Communist Party member, so people just didn't believe that it happened. It happened. After a while, after that, I got a very good push in my professional life in that institution, in the Institute for Applied Systems Analysis. The director of the institute was American Professor Roger Levian from Rand Corporation. It was a really interesting institution, still there. Now, return back, I was working on the mathematical modeling in population health, in public health, in these fields. Wrote a book and got my second PhD right just about that. And after it was published in '85, the guys from Chernobyl read it and from Kiev, and they said, please, you wrote it, do what you wrote. And this is how I got acquainted with Chernobyl. And it was great privilege, very smart people, very well educated. It was, the lab was called radioepidemiology, and demography. And that was a pretty short period of time, like 2 or 3 years. And the task was, for Chernobyl, was kind of simple. They were, not only they, but they asked me to help with my modeling, to help them to understand what was the consequences of the explosion in Chernobyl. And there were very, very clear, evident cases of impact on the health of kids. And they were mostly leukemia cases, and they were out of my scope of work. My work, the normal demographic analysis of death experience of those who lived in the contaminated areas, not who were exposed at the moment. There was not many people that were exposed. It's about 30 or 40 firefighters, but they ended up with acute radiation sickness, so it's nothing to explain more than that. However, the population who lived in the contaminated areas was political thing for Ukrainians, and that was the time when Ukraine and Russia separated, and they wanted the Russian work. And I was and it was professional challenge to find out. I must say that nothing special was found. And that was also finding, but one of the reasons is that they wanted the population, those who exposed to the risk, altogether, Russia and Ukraine and Belarus was about 11 million people. However, it was like a plume covered them in the first days or even weeks after the fire in Chernobyl. It covered huge area from Kiev, about 600 miles toward Moscow, and stopped there because of the rain. Where the rain dropped, the area is still considered as contaminated. Now, my task was to use my instrumentation. I developed the computer programs for that. And since the populations were very small, and this is the effect of the small sample, small population, I couldn't find anything statistically significant. Of course, there are findings, but they were not statistically significant. And we reported that the chief of that lab I mentioned in Kiev, Professor Nikolai, I'll give you the name. We reported in 2001, it was the conference in Kiev 15 years after the Chernobyl. And that was the last thing I did for Chernobyl. That was international conference, 15 years of Chernobyl, and that's what I did. And after that, I was came here, and almost immediately, I was lucky. I contacted people who were the doctors who wanted me to participate in their Hanford Chelyabinsk movement, and mostly from Seattle. It was Bruce Amundsen and the other doctors, and they wanted me to join them because they needed some Russian who could help them with their contacts with Chelyabinsk, its counterpart of Hanford, almost replica. Same style reactors, same technologies, stolen from here, as you probably know. And the idea was to help Russian partners, Russian friends, to take into account the American experience working with the same problems. The Russians were not aware. I would like to speak more about this later if you want. And this is how I joined the team. Pretty soon, it was 92, the year when I came to this country, 1992. And I met Tom and was offered with kind of interesting, I would say, mathematical problem. Yeah? Tom Falls, genius. He has no at all mathematical or scientific education, formal education. However, he has natural intuition, which he saw the things I couldn't see. And he said, try here, find here. He pointed me at the spot where he thought we have a solution for a problem, and he was right. And since then, since 92, I work for him. Yeah. That was my trajectory. I also work since 96. I also work for the health department in Pierce County as epidemiologist, responsible for public health evaluation. That's my whole story. Excuse me for a lengthy story, but, but I like to talk about it.
Definitely, this is wonderful. So let's pick up some of these threads. You said you wanted to go back to what topic was it? Chelyabinsk? Was that? Do you want to start there? You know, you mentioned your book in '86.
85.
85.
It was published in 85.
Okay. Could you name of your book?
Name is mine. And the title of the book, use of, excuse me, it is in Russian, use of, not mathematics, use of quantitative modeling for solving public health problems. That was the title for my dissertation, and that was the title of the book. Mostly it is the same. What instigated the cleanup effort at Hanford? It's not my question, of course, because it is question to Tom Falls, and I historically, but the question is great. To me, I thought, I couldn't find really exact question, but I thought, okay, let's compare the Hanford and the brother site Chelyabinsk. Why the mitigation, $1 billion are going there to clean and the Russians don't do anything? Why? Can I find the answer to answer this question here? That was the only way for me to answer. I compared. And this is, Cynthia, what I found in my vision of the world. The life here is very much based on, relied on, people even don't think maybe about it, the principle, legislative principle of a right to know. The first time I've seen these words from Tom Falls. Yeah. And right to know led those who started it. Tom was pioneering on that. To open the documents previously classified for the government, then Tom look at that, and then Tom, it was natural for this system here, started the litigation against those who it may not even thinkable, imaginable in Russia, in the former Soviet Union, and now. That's why, so similar technologically, they are so different in their history. And what struck me most is the answer is very compact if you go to the root, right to know. Doesn't exist in Russia. regularly about my more than 20 years experience with Tom. And it is one of the sweetest part in my life. It was so challenging professionally, socially, very interesting.
Well, why don't you tell us about it? Maybe start with how you met him and then how you became engaged and what your role was.
I know that he was a successful lawyer with industrial things like fire in the hotel or something like that. Then he turned his life toward to help people who suffer from this event. And in other words, those who manufacture these weapon-grade plutonium in Hanford, they exposed people to the risk not telling them. And he wanted to help them, or if they died, to their families. And he devoted the last big piece of his life, about 25, 30 years, just working for them. So this is personality. Now, professionally, he asked me to do some work for him, and this is his wonderful intuition, worked first time. He said, here is the report of those who are doing research in Hanford showing harmful or not harmful was productions. It was PNNL, Pacific North Labs. And he said, they must be wrong here. Can you do your math work to show? And I translated into the math language, and he was right. And it was accepted by the defendants. And that was my triumphal point. And after that, he asked me one by one. He wanted me to work, and I worked on the estimation of the radioiodine, 131 releases from the Hanford stacks. He wanted me to do the same with plutonium releases. He wanted me, that's the big projects. There were also some minor projects.
So these releases that you tried to quantify, I assume, were those from 1944 to 89 when they shut the place?
Yeah, but the latest years, I think I worked with them, but they were not very significant. Yeah, most of them were before, if it comes to iodine, before, I think, January 51, when silver reactors, the filters, were installed. That was the massive. And one of the massive was the Green Run. It was December 49. And he wanted me to estimate, this is how the project was designed. It was kind of the same as the defendants did before. First, estimate the schedule and amounts of the releases from the stacks from November, December 44. I think it was, it was Christmas time in 44 when they dissolved the first rods. And that was the first, it is called source term. The next one was done by the physicist in Florida, Doug Stewart. It was the transportation of these releases over the Earth, mostly towards Spokane in northeast direction. This is how Downwinders were appearing because of that. Next was the model for the model which described how these contaminants, mostly iodine, dropped to the vegetation and through the food chain through the cows went to the kids. That's the third. And the fourth was estimate the doses and risks. So I did the first one, and that I have a newspaper with me. My work was published here in Seattle, just about that. And the last piece was done by a scientist who is now in England, and when he, at the very last years, I think a couple of years of litigation, he said that he is sick, and Tom asked me to do that part. So I participated. I used the methods used before for the risks or doses estimations, not risks. And that was my part. This is how the project, Tom's project, was structured, and how we, what was our roles in that.
So did you need to get information from the Department of Energy that was still classified, or was it just at the moment that they had declassified everything you needed to know? Or, I mean, was that getting the data? Was that hard?
No, Tom was the digger. He provided me with the data I asked him for. But that was mostly for the first part, source term model. That was the routine records every day, how much material, well, what is the weight of the rods dissolved, cooling time in the cooling pools. It was just routine records. It's nothing more than that. Mm-hmm. And then I used them as the input for my model. What was the output of my model, I sent it to Doug Stewart to Florida.
I mean, what was the fourth part that you looked at? The dosages?
Doses, yeah. I did that because Tom was almost ready to go to the court, mm-hmm. and court was waiting for that. And the gentleman who worked for that part, I think he had some late form of cancer, and he asked to release him from that. But he was generous. He wrote a couple of brilliant books, and I could see how he calculated all of that. I just repeated that. Having those was not enough, and Tom wanted me, and this is my last really significant project for me, he wanted me to calculate the risks, because the dose says nothing to the judge, and judge wanted give me the data which I, judge, can use for my decision. And I calculated probabilities of causation, which is the standard for industry, which is the metric accepted in the professional community as just for this purpose. So I calculated that. Yeah.
So what? Give me. So the standard metric in the industry is that so many micrograms of X will produce Y, or what is
no, no. That was more related to the dosage. Now, as soon as we were working with thyroid diseases, the dose on the thyroid was calculated. Now, as soon as the dose is calculated, the judge would like to know, okay, I can see the dose and I trust the dose. Now, give me the argument if this dose is dangerous and responsible for this thyroid disease, or it is just background. Women especially, they have thyroid disease without any exposure to the radiation. We call it background morbidity, and how to distinguish between the two. And this is how this marker or measure, metric, was born. It is called probability of causation. And it is understandable by the judges, in the judges community, because it intuitively understandable. It means that the disease was caused by this agent, exposure, more likely than not. And everybody understands that. If they don't think deeply, they understand it. In our case, judge in the last litigation activity, Tom, the judge, for some reasons, refused to use that, and he said, "Can you calculate the odds?" Okay, we calculated the odds. The court may say, "I don't want to use this metric," and that's the problem. As in our case, the judge said, "Please bring me odds." And instead of showing him probability of causation is 63%, he got another, the same expression. The probability is 2.3 to 1. To me, the first one is much easier explainable, but he prefers the second one, and it is up to him.
So you submitted this in 2.3 to 1?
Yeah.
Yeah. And
Yeah.
then what happened?
According to Tom, it was settlement. It was not court hearings. It was settlement, as cases before that, same scenario. And the clients were rewarded with the money. Tom told me that they were happy with that. That's what I know.
So you did your work well.
I'm happy with that.
That's good. That's
Yeah.
great. Yeah. Gosh, it's just hard to believe that this went on for 24 years. The litigation took 24 years, is that correct?
Yeah, but I would like to see the movie about that. It is so dramatic. It is so dramatic. See, once it was closed, the judge, MacDonald, who considered that case, said it's not, he rejected that. Tom applied to the Court of Appeal in California with 3 judges. In a couple of years, they said he was wrong. And we returned back to our work. It was a very unpredictable history.
So the Court of Appeals in California referred the case back.
No, not to the same judge. The court or whoever decided to dismiss judge. Mm-hmm. And we had another judge who was more reasonable.
Mm. And was it that judge who was asking for the odds? Is that the judge?
Maybe. I don't know. Maybe. I don't know the names. I know McDonald's was that judge. Interesting, just recalled, the argument was Judge MacDonald has conflict of interests. It turned to be right, because he purchased land to produce apples in the contaminated area, and he didn't want it to be. No.
So there was 2.3 to 1 odd, or 62% probability that people...
The numbers are made up. It could be, the numbers are made up. It's just for illustration. It could be not 2.3, but could be 2.1. But it doesn't matter.
Anyway, there was, you came up with an analysis that showed there were, the odds were, or probabilities were, that these exposed people in the Hanford plume or in Downwinders had certain levels of exposures that would have caused a cancer in thyroid
Well, I had different groups. The last group was thyroid disease, or the group is called any thyroid disease, or thyroiditis, or nodules. It was groupings, because for each group, the math is the same, but the parameters are different for calculating probability of causation.
Mm-hmm. I see. So how many groups were there?
I guess 5.
Mm-hmm. And they were arranged by the different outcomes.
Right. It was Professor Lindquist who provided me this data. I had, I think, 23. That's the last group. I had 23 people, and I'm not sure about 23. And they were grouped by the category of disease, which was diagnosed. See, that's an interesting story. It's not the prediction. It's not, I have a dose, like in Chernobyl now. I have a dose, I know my dose, and I want to know what are the prognosis for the development. Now, this is a different story. This is, I have the diagnosis right here. Sometimes it is death. So it is very concrete. Now go backward, tell me what was the cause. See, that logically it is slightly different, but it's different modeling. Mm-hmm. So this is the group I have. And I met some of them, some of these, mostly women I worked on.
So you must have had to work with health professionals, or at least they'd have gathered from biologists who could help relate certain levels of dose of, iodine 131 and this and that to likelihood of getting these outcomes. Is that correct? How did this work?
Thank you for this question. That was the most interesting work for me, because I will be presenting this piece in Tri-Cities in the nuclear conference in October. And I'll be talking right about that. Mm-hmm. See, this is how to answer this question. There are nationally known, available on the internet, software which is designed for everyone, like you and me, to enter your data, and they tell you what is your dose if you don't know. Or if you provide the dose, they tell you what is your probability of causation related to that. It is IRAP, designed by Department of Labor, Federal Department, and CDC, I guess. It's very solid. It's it's the standard in industry. However, it covers only those who worked for the Department of Energy, who were workers. Those who were kids and they were exposed, downwinders, they are ignored by the program. Say, I don't know you. You're not supposed to, because I count for the ages 16 and over or 18 and over. So, but our clients were kids when they were exposed. So that program wouldn't answer. Another program is designed for every age, but specific to Nevada test sites, radiation coming from Nevada test site, And our case wouldn't work for that. And Tom, back to his fantastic intuition. And he said, design the program which goes to the same standards, but specific to our situation. And that's what we did. I'll be reporting that. It uses, by the way, it uses Chernobyl data. Because Chernobyl team, excuse me for my language, but they very well used Chernobyl experiment on kids. I'm sorry, please understand me correctly. Of course it's not experiment, but it is experiment, because this is the first time ever the population was, not planned experiment, was exposed to iodine coming from the fire. It was not explosion, it was fire. And the data collected was so unique, so important, and was immediately converted into the very good research paid by Germany, World Health Organization. By the way, when I worked on Chernobyl, World Health Organization was there already, in Kiev, Chernobyl part. So the data they found are the only missing part in my model I needed. And the missing part is, if the kids are exposed in the early childhood to iodine, radiation absorbed, inhaled, mostly drink, milk, or any other way, what is the lifetime risk of develop thyroid disease? And the team, it's international team, half of that was Ukrainian guys, many from, I could see the names from other countries as well. It was international team. I know none of them, except for one, Likhtaryov, who was the leader of Ukrainian team. I know him. And they collected the data, analyzed the data, and published that parameter, which was missing part in my model. And I got it. Yeah, and Tom, that was Tom, who actually, he found that publication. He gave it to me, and he said, read it carefully, you will find something. This is how it works.
Maybe I could throw it out. You said during the 1940s and 1950s there was a lot of iodine coming out of the plant. Do you know how many people were exposed at that time in the area?
I should know, but I cannot give you the number now.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
I worked on that 20 years ago.
Oh, okay.
15. I have a number. The number of people who were registered as downwinders, we call them downwinders, our clients in Tom's office, was over 2,000. We also had in other office, Ayman, the lead in Spokane, and another one was in Oregon. So there are 3 offices, and one of them ours was, that's what I know.
What are the effects of radiation exposure?
There are many ways to address this question, but roughly you can break this issue into parts. First is high dose, and the effect is death. It's acute radiation disease, and people, for example, in Kiev, no, they died in Moscow, but they were exposed in Kiev, the firemen. They were dying with manifestation of symptoms of pneumonia. Because the sickness itself is characterizing by the oppression of the immune system. As soon as the immune system is oppressed, these guys are the first to come, pneumonia, and they kill. So this is the effect. Mathematically more interesting probably is the low dose, because the effect is not that simple, and we call it stochastic effect. It may or may not happen. And here, solid corpus of knowledge is available now. I compare to what they had when they started to produce weapon grades, radioactive materials. They didn't know that as much as we know now. Now there are ways to measure the radiation exposure in Gray, in Sievert. They measure. Actually, physically, it's very simple. It's the exposure, the radiation, is just the vehicle which gives to some organ or tissue energy. It's the vehicle transports energy to the tissue, and tissue absorbs this energy, and you just calculate 1 joule of energy. This is how energy is measured per gram of tissue, and this is Gray. This is what we use, how we measure the dose, how much the dose absorbed. There is a little bit more sophisticated Sievert, but anyway, it is measured. Now, and you can consider these effects at the level of cells when the energy was transported to the organ, like lung or thyroid, and as soon as it is absorbed, it makes the changes in the molecular composition of the tissue. It kills some of the cells. Some of the cells are not killed by transformed, and then they were removed by the immune system, because the immune system is sensitive. Is it my or not my? We call it immune passport. It checks all the cells. Some of the cells survive, but they are cancerous. They may or may not be removed by the system, but if they are not removed, they proliferate and cancer starts. This is the cell level. At the individual level, by the way, during this conversation, each of us had cancerous cells, and it's the life we live in, but our immune system knows how to remove them from the body. So it's not something really specific to some special case. It's just a normal life of human body. And by the way, we are exposed to the normal radiation every minute, and again, it's normal. So we shouldn't consider that something happened in Chernobyl or in Hanford. No, we live in this world. Individual level. So at the individual level, as soon as this malignant cell, not benign, but malignant cell, initiate or born somehow because of the radiation and proliferating, we don't feel that. We may have cancer, we don't know about that. Only when manifestation of cancer comes. But eventually the cells, eventually the cells proliferate and they create metastasis, and this is how, in the individual level, radiation works. It just starts the malignant process, killing the body. At the population level, that's my professional part. My work is here. At the populational level, we simply calculate the risks for population or proportion of population. Say population is exposed to some risk factor, like radiation. We can calculate the proportion which will develop the disease, and the dynamics of that. How much time it would take, because the cancer starts today, but you may die, or a person may die in 5 years. However, the cancer already existing is scheduled for 15 years from now. We don't know about that. So we can only know these statistically firm characteristics of the population exposure as proportion who will develop this quality and when death or manifestation of the disease, which is diagnosis, will occur. So it may say exposed now, 10 years from now, it might be revealed or diagnosed as like skin cancer. And the death may or may not come in another 10 years. This is the dynamic at the population level. Describe the problem of tank waste. It is the problem. As a member of Washington chapter of Physicians for Social Responsibility, I participate in HUB. It is Hanford Advisory Board, and now I'm working as the member of the Tank Waste Committee, it is called. So I regularly have information about what is going on there. You know why should I explain why the tanks are there, or it is known?
Sure.
Okay. When the technology of extracting plutonium from the fuel rods suggested that after they were irradiated and cooled for a month or so in the water pool, they were dissolved, and chemically the plutonium was extracted from the rods, and all accompanying byproduct like iodine released from the rods. However, as soon as they were dissolved, the resulting liquid should be dumped somewhere, and the tanks were built to keep these highly toxic liquid in the tanks. Just parallel. In Russia, they use just natural lake to dump there, not telling people don't swim. The lake is called Karachay. Now they said, well, that's Russia. Now, as for Hanford, with the time going on, the liquid, the content dumped to the tanks changed. We have liquid, and we have some mass like sludge, and some more dense like wet sand on the ocean shore, something pretty hard. Now, liquid was removed, but now the problem is what to do with these portions, highly toxic materials, and their behavior is not always predictable. By they, I mean the sediments. Additional problem is there were signs showing leaking from some of the tanks. Especially for me was surprising that double shell tanks show the leakage. And now the problem with the tanks, the engineers have here how to remove these heavy, sludgy stuff from the bottom, and they try different technologies to make a pulp, to make it like liquid, to remove it. I'm not sure how successful it is. This is the problem: leakage and not easily removable sludge. That's the tanks. That's what I know.
So the committee is trying to, or the Hanford Advisory Board is trying to figure out what the end plan is. What to do with these waste.
Hanford Advisory Board is in the position to give advice. However, it is like Politburo, and all the work is going in the committees. So in the Tank Waste Committee, people work on the matter, what is going on and what would be the better way to do it. It is approved by the Politburo and then goes to those who work in the field. This is how it works. Sometimes I'm a little bit confused as the member of that. We are representing general public with our concerns, and we want to do our best. However, those who work really on that, who are thinking, making mistakes, correcting them, and we are teaching them the lesson, sometimes it seems to me a little bit...
You're doing what?
It seems to me a little bit not adequate. So how can I give a good advice if I didn't try that, and they really work in the field. They're reporting us how they work, what they do, the engineers, and I'm amazed. It's highly professional, very responsible. No accidents, by the way. We had, in the Hanford history, I think they had about 17 deaths in construction, when they did construction. In McCloskey case, it was exposure to the radiation. But anyway, what they do now, of course, it's maybe not comparable to the history, but they do, I really highly appreciate what they do here with this clinic. And like their predecessors, they were the first in the human history building the capacity to produce plutonium. These guys are first in the history to clean that. I guess it is more expensive, probably more sophisticated. Yeah, that's what I learned being in that team.
So do you want to talk about what you learned from your work on the analysis that you did on the Downwinders, or more generally from what you found about the afflictions of these people? And what are your thoughts about your experience?
You mean technical, social, moral?
All of the above.
Morally, I'm proud I'm part of this team. It makes my life meaningful. That's simple. Technically, I learned every day, because this is the beauty of work, my past work with Tom. Whatever he asked me to do, my first reaction was, I don't know how to do it. So learning was a natural process. Many times I simply did not know. I understood what he asked, but I don't know how to approach. But that was challenge, and it gives you some joy of accomplishment. Socially, I did what I can do. It was additional feeling which is, I'm not sure if it is interesting to mention, but I can tell, I always feel the Russian who is helping Americans. I came to this country when I was 50 years old. My life, all of my life was there, in the Soviet Union. And all of a sudden, I am among those who, during all of my life, were called enemies. America exists just for one reason, to kill us. Can you imagine that? It's not easy to imagine. No, it's easy to imagine, but it is it's internal feeling. So that was additional flavor to work. And also, I was lucky I met people like Tom, who, to me, he's just etalon. He's just the model of honest, skillful, man of integrity. It was another joy of work, just communicating with him. We are still having fun together, having lunch and so forth. I just enjoy this. He was a boy, 18 years old boy, who was in the war. D-Day, June 44, when American and Canadian and English crossed the La Manche, and you know this story. One of them was Tom Falls.
He was on the invasion?
Yeah.
Oh my goodness. Wow. Good for him.
As every real soldier who was exposed to death, he never, ever spoke about that, just mentioned. I'm very proud of him.
Do you remember anything from the war since you were born in 42?
Yeah.
In Moscow?
Yeah.
Good thing it wasn't Leningrad.
It was not Leningrad, no.
That must have been hard, the siege.
I know something about Leningrad, and it was terrible. Now, Moscow was more relaxed. My dad was engineer. They produced aircrafts for the army, just for the war. And by the way, their airfield was several miles from the German line. So when they flew, he told me that story. Yeah. What I remember about the wartime, interesting that in the Russian language in my time, in my generation, the combination of the words before the war and after the war, quotation, it was part of the language. Not anymore, of course, but I remember if my parents spoke to each other, oh, that was before the war. So it was part of their, significant part of their life. What I remember about the war, the German soldiers worked in the area where we lived, and we just played with them because they were just workers, and they built the telephone station, telephone relay, two-story building. And I remember them. We were Fritz, Kamerad, and they responded, and they were very friendly. That's the only thing I remember. Yeah. And of course, it was the time when people didn't have enough food. That's what I remember about post-war time.
Did not have enough food.
Mhm.
Yeah. Very hard times. And you lost 20 million men.
No, nobody knows how many. First, it was 7. Then Stalin decided, why 7? Why don't you say 20? And 20 appeared.
Oh.
It was his recommendation to. Nobody calculated them. Nobody counted because nobody cared. 2 of my uncles went through the war, and we were normally stupid for the small kids. We didn't ask the questions I would ask now. And we couldn't grasp the fantastic amount of suffering. We were just kids. When time came and we realized what it is, life changed. Yes, it was definitely more than. I can give you another story because I was working with the demographers, medical demographers, and professional demographers. Now it is the Research Center Institution in Moscow, and they told me, oh, well, it's a well-known story how the Demographic Institute in Moscow was dismissed because they made a mistake when doing census for Russia in 1937. And they just reported that we are missing about so many, like 3-5 million people. Just we couldn't see them. You know, Stalin's reaction was he dismissed the institute and punished those who came with these findings and asked to repeat the census correctly. And they repeat correctly. This is how the numbers in the Soviet Union, like 20 million, were appearing to the surface. Yeah, by the way, some punished is the soft word for gulag. $20 million. No. How many million they just killed for fun? And not Germans. Stalin killed Russians more than Hitler killed Russians. And, well, it started in 1919 when the concentration camps were established. Then civil war, which is just bloodshed. So. Then 1937, then the war. There are so stories about that war. Those who participated in the war, they passed away, of course, but they wrote, it is called soldier stories, not general story, but soldier story. And their expression normally is Stalin won the war, just covering Germans by our dead bodies. No, that corrupted the psychology of the whole nation. To kill is normal. Now it is returning back, by the way. They are not killing, but they are definitely misbehaving. Killing, by the way, in Ukraine, it's the war. They kill the Ukrainians for nothing.
resisted collectivization, right? Oh, I was thinking about in the 30s.
30s, yeah, it was, no, actually it started in 29, 30, yeah, the first 5-year plan. Yeah. Collectivization was part of that. It changes mentality, not of the person, but for the whole nation, as if agreement, like, behave that way. Like when you reduce the temperature in the vessel with, say, with the water, every molecule moves slower. So the temperature is the general characteristic of the water, but for each molecule, who is a person, each molecule moves slower and slower. This is what is happening in Russia. They change the temperature, and socially, psychologically, morally, people are slower.
You said you have Utopia there.
Yeah.
Right. So
Yeah.
what do you think of that book?
Very well written. Well, she didn't include something which I would include. What she is writing is correct, and I appreciate her detailed vision. I would do a little bit more, but she probably didn't have access to the documents, or it's. See, the Mayak in Chelyabinsk was built by the prisoners, but it's Gulag, and so many people died. It's not her plan probably to go into the details. That's one part. Another part is she is not writing about that oppressive behavior of, the slowed down molecules who are the Soviet people. This is what I would do. But I realize that my vision and my position is probably slightly biased to the point that I'm sensitive to unfairness, to the humiliation of my people. And maybe I'm bad, maybe not.
So what do you think of her depiction of Hanford?
Well written, and I learned from her something I couldn't learn when I read the declassified documentation. No, she knows more. She shows more. For example, about Green Run, nothing in the documents available for me, by the way. Nothing. From her, I could see how it worked.
You weren't given access to the documents.
I guess it was not even written. I guess, see, she associates the Green Run with the experimentation, how the plume with the green fuel, with the evaporation from the green fuel, when it was dissolved, how it travels and what are the concentrations, what are the characteristics of that plume, and that was it. She says it was important for surveillance on the Russian-Soviet nuclear program, because the Americans could register the radiation at the remote areas, remote from Mayak. This is what she says, and it looks reasonable. If I was American general, I would definitely do so, maybe. Nothing about that in the documentation. And Tom would be very, very interested in that if he found that. No. Yeah, she shows pretty good knowledge. She tries to depict, to describe the behaviors of Russian family or Russian people, how nice they are and how enthusiastically they worked. Probably she knows better.
You're quite a pilgrim. Are there others that you said when you went to Vienna to study, that was very unusual?
Not study, we were just research fellows. No, it was right after my first Ph.D. No. But that was my first exposure to the West. My first lesson, hey, wait a minute. Yeah, they are capitalist and they are trying to kill us tomorrow or day after tomorrow, but why I don't see any traces of that.
That's great. That's very funny.
But see, this is what they hear every day in the Soviet schools. That was just sound every day. Brainwashing. Real brainwashing. And I understand very well why the Germans, after they were defeated, after the war, 46, 47, 48, they were still supporter for Hitler. Most. I know that because my grandson is German. I go there. My son's family is there, and I speak openly with people, and they confirm that. Yes, brainwashing was extremely, without TV, extremely efficient, and most of people still had this disease. Soviet propaganda was more efficient, I guess, because of the technical capabilities. But it has nothing to do with Hanford. My hope that sometime this Hanford litigation experience will be used in Russia.
Well, probably not in the immediate future. Yeah, and then by then it gets very difficult. Well, I suppose the exposures are going to be continuing since they haven't cleaned it up.
Of course.
Yeah. So it could be useful. Yeah.
Useful probably in terms of how it is planned, what to do. For example, you have money and you have will to do this job, how to plan it. And this experience is about how it is organized, planned, what Tom did.
Yeah, there again, we can learn so much from each other, not as enemies, but as collaborators.
By we,
U.S. and or American and Russian scientists.
Oh, scientists, of course.
Yes.
But scientists prefer to go from from Moscow to the United States. I've seen so many of them.
Is that right? Have you?
Oh yeah, so many.
And leave. And
They leave.
Permanently.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Like I did,
Yeah.
because it's a bad time for them. Ironically, in the Soviet time, it was more comfortable for the scientists to do their work.
Than the present.
Mhm.
Well, I guess, why was that?
Science, it had two functions. First, it was like Bolshoi belly dancing. You know, we are proud, we have the best in the world, and our scientists the best in the world. We are proud. We pay them, but let them be here like belly dancers, showing that we are the first. Second, probably more important, was it was time for good quality science. Math, we have great institutions in Moscow and in St. Petersburg, in Siberia, in Novosibirsk as well. Physics, so many great names came from the new physics, I mean, nuclear physics research, like academician Budker, so many great names. Even the Iron Curtain existed, but that community was self-sustaining scientifically, and of course they needed the context, but they could work. Because they convinced the guys above that this work is needed for the bomb, the rockets, and that was true. This is how it worked. They don't care about bomb anymore because it is already here. I mean, no research is needed to make new things. Why? We can kill with the old one, with the old technologies. And many of my friends, because of age as well, they are leaving science simply because who cares about their results? It was not the case 30, 40, 50 years ago. No. No, we were very well paid. We lived in Academy of Sciences. It was like island of privileged people who feel really free. In the jail, but we were free.
Yeah.
But most people were prisoners in the jail. No, we were free.
Prisoners in their own country.
Yeah, because we were limited in where to go, what to say. Between us it was okay, but generally fear was the major controlling factor. Fear was, and now it's back again, fear works better than police.